Hey, today we're going to talk more about cravings, but I want to first kind of tack on a little definition of consecration. So we have our 5 areas of spiritual movement in spiritual formation. The first 3 are things that happen whether I'm connected to God or not. But just because I'm connected to God doesn't mean these 3 will not manifest themselves. In fact, we want to be attentive to them because they're there. Our cravings, and our cravings oftentimes lead us to a crisis of belief. And our crisis will produce consequences. So just think about that. Our cravings often lead us to a crisis, and our crisis will produce consequences. A person without conversion, without the fourth one, without converting to Jesus, will just run a cycle of those things. It's a bit like the addictive cycle. Our cravings cause us to want to pursue and apprehend something that we perceive will satisfy us, will fulfill us, will satiate us. Invariably, they do not, because it's Blaise Pascal's little statement. There's a God-shaped hole in the heart, in every one of us, that can only be filled by God as revealed through Jesus Christ. So I crave things, but they're never going to satisfy, because Jesus is the only thing that can ultimately satisfy my cravings. Because ultimately I'm craving connection with God. I'm craving intimacy with Him. But my cravings will lead me to a crisis, and now what do I do? The crisis then is going to have some consequences that leave a sobering effect on my life. Then I say a conundrum. These are all C words. A conundrum. And my conundrum is, do I turn to faith? Do I turn to God? Or do I go back to my cravings? That's my conundrum. So the next 2 are conversion. That's when we come into faith with God. And then consecration. And that's the work that God does in us, oftentimes called sanctification. He wants to sanctify us. And the sanctification process is accelerated whenever we consecrate. We give. In fact, here's a definition for consecration. Consecration is the action of making or declaring something. The action of making or declaring something fully devoted, yielded, and surrendered to God. I'll say it again. Consecration is the action of making or declaring something fully devoted, yielded, and surrendered to God. Ultimately, that's what God desires for us. It's the Romans 12:1, right? I urge you, dear brothers and sisters, I urge you to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. What's he doing? He's consecrating. He's dedicating himself fully to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. So this consecration piece. So that's our destination. That's where we're moving towards. So the sooner we can get to a life of consecration, the sooner we can recognize and feel the joy of God's blessings flowing to us and out through us. Cravings. We all have them. We all have cravings. Last week we talked about blessing blockers. And I said that blessing blockers come usually in one of 2 spaces: wrong appetites and mismanaged motives. Wrong appetites and mismanaged motives. So when we're talking about cravings, we're talking about these wrong appetites. And an appetite can be incredibly intoxicating or relatively innocuous. Oftentimes, an innocuous appetite could be an appetite for sex. Sex by itself is not wrong for us to have an appetite for that. It's when the appetite's out of balance that it becomes wrong. It becomes aberrant. Craving for food is not wrong in and of itself. It's innocuous. But when out of balance, it can become aberrant, right? So we want to keep our appetites in balance. We do that through consecration, the last step. But the Bible speaks so much about cravings because it's where the battle Much of our battle is fought. The person without a relationship with God, the cravings throw them into a spiral of addiction. For the believer, it throws us into a spiral upward into consecration, into movement to God, as we learn to manage and purify those cravings. Listen to a couple of biblical authors. All the biblical authors, but especially the New Testament authors, speak about cravings. James, the half brother of Jesus, says in chapter 1, verse 14, he says, each person is tempted when they're dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. We're tempted when a craving drags us away. Talk about the power of an addiction. It can drag us into something. He goes on then a couple chapters later and asks the question, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You want something but don't get it, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God, and when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives. James, very clear. Desires, cravings, appetites have an evil presence. Their roots are evil. The Apostle Paul says it many, many places. One of my favorite, Ephesians 4:22. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, listen to this, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. Be made new in the attitude of your minds. This juxtaposition of these cravings, put them off, be renewed in the attitude of your minds, be transformed, be consecrated. And then we got Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. He says, dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain, here it is, from sinful desires which war at your soul. Your desires can war at your soul. Saying that if we don't recognize, get some identification of our desires, they put us in a battle we're likely to lose if we are not yielding ourselves to Jesus. So today, join me with a fresh sense of consecration. We want to consecrate our desires to you, Lord. Help us to identify anything aberrant, anything toxic, and purify us, Lord Jesus. We submit our thoughts to you, Lord. Enable us to take captive those thoughts because they will guide us. They will give us insights about desires that would war at our soul, that would corrupt our good intentions. We yield ourselves to you today, Lord. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks so much for being here. God bless.